The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we look at how a Trump presidency could affect the Russia-Ukraine war, now into its 1,000th day. Then, a look at the causes of student misbehavior in Ontario's classrooms. That's all ahead on the agenda. Today, November 19th, 2024, marks a grim milestone for the Russia-Ukraine war. Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II has reached its 1,000th day. Now, with U.S. President Joe Biden authorizing Ukraine to launch American long-range missiles into Russia, and incoming President Donald Trump's promise to end the war, where does that leave things for these two adversaries? Let's find out from, in Odessa, Ukraine, Michael Bostercue. He is a geopolitical analyst and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. In Montreal, Quebec, Maria Popova, associate professor of political science at McGill University and co-author of Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States. And with us here in studio, Timothy Snyder, the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University and the author of On Freedom. And Lucan Ahmed Way, Distinguished Professor of Democracy at U of T and co-director of the Petro Jasic Program for the Study of Ukraine. And we're grateful to see you two here in our studio. And to Michael and Maria in Points Beyond, thank you for joining us on TVO tonight. Just before we start our discussion, let's just get some of the latest stats on the record here if we can. And I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osman, to bring up these graphics. According to the Council on Foreign Relations Center for Preventive Action, since Russia's full-scale invasion more than 2 years ago, Ukraine has recaptured 54% of occupied territory, while Russia still occupies 18% of the country. Since January of 2022, so almost 3 years ago, Ukraine has received about $278 billion in aid, including $75 billion from the United States. Fighting and airstrikes have inflicted more than 30,000 civilian casualties, while 3.7 million people are internally displaced and 6.5 million have fled Ukraine altogether. In total, 14.6 million people need humanitarian assistance, and we should add that United Nations and Ukrainian officials say the figures are actually probably much higher, given the difficulty in verifying deaths and injuries, especially in areas such as the devastated port city of Mariupol that are now in Russian hands. And let's flip over to this map if we can, Sheldon, because Michael is joining us from Odessa in southwest Ukraine. It is the third most populous city in Ukraine, a major seaport on the northwestern shore of the Black Sea. And there were Russian missile attacks just the other day in Odessa, 10 fatalities, many people wounded, lots of buildings damaged. So we cross our fingers, Michael, for your safety and your participation here. Let's start with you in Ukraine. The 1,000th day, as we've indicated. How, in your view, have the Ukrainian people withstood so much bloodshed?
Great to be with you. Thank you for having me. Well, as you might have guessed by the visual, I'm sitting in the dark, as are probably millions of Ukrainians at the moment, because of the heavy pounding from Russian strikes on critical infrastructure in Ukraine. Odessa is a world port city, should be seen that way by the global community. Many countries, as you know, rely on the food that comes out of Odessa ports. But yet, a small group of men in the Kremlin have been given free rein to decide what comes in and out of the port and how much of Ukrainian grain feeds the world. And they're also reported to be constraining trade in the in the Red Sea through the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. So, you know, I think a lot of people here, it's fair to say, on this 1,000th day, a lot of people in Ukraine are saying, where is the global outrage? Where is the outrage when the Russians stop food going from Odessa, when they're pounding people into the dark ages, literally? So having said all that, especially in Odessa, which is historically an entrepreneurial city built by many different nationalities, there's what I've always called a irrepressible resilience. People go on no matter what, whether it's in terms of fighting or in terms of volunteer work, in terms of keeping their businesses going. But there is a weariness, a tiredness happening. And in a way, that's going to put pressure on the Zelensky administration to find some way to end the war. And kind of to wrap up, I mean, no one here that I've met feels that any territory should be given up. They want everything to go back to 1991 lines. Whether that will happen at the negotiating table, we don't know. But it is fair to say also that a lot of worry what will happen in the next hours and days. Now that ATACMS are being used, what kind of response will that bring from the Russian side?
In which case, Maria, let me follow up with this. Is Ukraine, in your judgment, more vulnerable now than at any time since the war began? And if so, why do you believe so?
Yes, it's probably more vulnerable, in part because we have the Trump administration coming in about 8-10 weeks. And Trump, as you mentioned in the intro, has promised to settle this in a day. Now, he will find out that it is very, very difficult to settle this. First, because Putin has really not shown any realistic signs that he is ready to back off from the very maximalist gains, very maximalist goals that Russia has in this war, which is taking Ukrainian sovereignty. So we do speak a lot about what territory may be on the negotiating table, but I think we really need to remember that Russia is fighting this war not for territory, but to take Ukraine's sovereignty. And we're in a dangerous moment because it's not clear that the Trump administration understands that.
Timothy, how would you gauge Ukraine's vulnerability at this moment?
I think in a way it's a mistake for us to define it as Ukraine's vulnerability, because what's happened in the last 3 years or so is that Ukraine has taken all of our vulnerabilities upon itself. We forget that. We define Ukraine as a problem, when in fact Ukraine has been a solution. It's the Ukrainians who have been defending a rules-based world order. It's the Ukrainians who have been showing that nuclear blackmail doesn't have to work, and in that sense, deterring nuclear proliferation. It's the Ukrainians who have been showing the Chinese how difficult offensive operations are, and thereby deterring them. It's the Ukrainians who have been fulfilling essentially the entire NATO mission all by themselves with a certain amount of assistance from their allies. All of those are things that the Ukrainians have done. So of course, if we let Ukraine lose, Ukrainians are going to suffer. But I think the part that we have to remember, talking about this from a distance, is that the whole world order, whether we're talking about nuclear weapons, deterring China, international law, depends on how this turns out.
I appreciate the distinction you're making there, but I raise the issue, of course, because Donald Trump has been pretty clear, Lucan, in saying he's certainly not going to go to bat for Ukraine the way Joe Biden has. So thus the question about feeling vulnerable at the moment. What do you say?
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, Ukraine is made vulnerable by Trump. I think there's a hope within Ukraine that, you know, because of Trump's unpredictability, that he will be able, you know, that they will be able to convince him to change his mind. But I agree that that's unlikely. But I want to, you know, just second Tim's point that a lot of people see this war as kind of about Ukraine, and that, you know, that's really not sort of in our sort of interest or doesn't really affect us directly. But I think the point is that, you know, if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, it will start attacking the rest of Europe, obviously the Baltics, Eastern Europe, but even more broadly, that if Russia succeeds, we will return to an era not too long ago, you know, 70 or 80 years ago, when countries regularly invaded one another because they had territorial designs on their neighbors. So in other words, we have to think, you know, so what's at stake is much bigger than Ukraine. It's much bigger than Putin, than Russia. It affects, obviously, Taiwan. It affects, you know, nuclear proliferation. So if we don't defend Ukraine, you know, these smaller countries that face attacks, what are they going to do? They're going to get nuclear weapons.
Michael, we should put on the record here that Russia has announced this morning that Ukraine, I guess now that Joe Biden has given permission to do so, has fired long-range missiles into Russia. How do you think that changes the state of affairs?
That's right, although I noticed that Foreign Minister Lavrov has backpedaled a bit and said we can't confirm it. But I think it's a signal of how quickly these attacks can be ramped up. I did notice that they did struck in an area adjacent to the Kursk region, which is where apparently the United States has so far limited the use of these weapons by the Ukrainians. But I will venture to guess that the Ukrainians are very, very eager to strike far deeper into Russia. After all, the Russians have been able to exploit this delay, this drip-feed approach that the United States has instituted to move their weaponry far back, to move the fighter jets far back. And I would also venture to guess that the Ukrainians would be very eager to use these high-capacity missiles to strike at Putin's pet project, the Kerch Strait Bridge, not just because it is his pet project, but also because it is a vital conduit of military aid from mainland Russia to Crimea. If I could also add one more thing, I neglected in the first answer to just tell you how horrible the incoming missiles have impacted Odessa and Sumy and other cities. Steve, we're talking about apocalyptic scenes. Twice in the span of 1 week on Odessa, hundreds of apartment buildings flattened, fires and deaths and injuries. And the Russians are now using high payload drones that previously might have only struck a few apartment buildings, but now can take an entire apartment building in one foul swoop. So I mention this because you can imagine the feeling of the Ukrainians and their eagerness to strike back and neutralize these very launch pads in Russia where these missiles and drones are coming from.
Let me follow up with Timothy on that. Why do you think 1,000 days in, Joe Biden has now given the green light for Ukraine to attack deeper into Russia?
Okay, I'm first going to do something incredibly pedantic and point out that ATACMS are short-range missiles. The entire international press calls them long-range missiles, I think because that makes the thing sound spectacular, but they are in fact short-range missiles, and you are now going to break this story. I think, I mean, to echo what Michael was saying, the Biden administration's rollout has been incredibly slow. It's almost as though it's been designed for the Russians to know what comes next so they can make preparations for it. I think the fact that they know that Trump is coming has changed their calculus a little bit. Not only have they done this, they've also taken steps to make sure that all of the allocated weapons will be delivered to Ukraine by the middle of January of next year. I think the Biden administration does understand at this point that there is a legacy issue here, and that if they are going to have any sort of foreign policy record at all, it will have to do with having done the right thing for Ukraine. And that, of course, is very welcome, although, of course, in my view, it's taken way, way, way too long.
Maria, can I get you to weigh in on this notion that Mr. Biden's got 2 months left in the presidency and he's got to do something in that time if he wants to make a dent in history here?
Yeah, it's a little too late. He probably is doing it because there is a window in which, of course, Russia will not escalate in any dramatic way because it's waiting for a friendlier U.S. administration, and it just has to sit out the next few weeks. But it really underscores that the Biden administration has been incredibly conservative, very, very slow, and very, very overcautious. And the fact that they only now feel ready to take the step, which is not a major step, let's face it. We discuss it a lot, but it is not a humongous change in Ukrainian capability. The fact that they've only now dared to take this step really shows that they've been self-limiting their steps all along, and they're haven't really been committed to Ukrainian victory, but to only keeping Ukraine in the fight. And this will be their legacy. It's not going to dramatically change their legacy.
Having said that, Lucan, does it open the door for England, for France, for other European countries to similarly open the door wider for Ukraine?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think, there is a concern the United States is basically kind of irreplaceable in terms of, given the size of the military, all the democratic West accounts for about half of military spending of the United States, so it's going to be hard to replace. But I do want to sort of speak to the issue of, which was kind of implied in your question about escalation. I mean, obviously the Biden administration has put incredible restrictions on Ukraine because it says, as Biden said, we don't want World War III. And I think a lot of sort of people are saying, well, we can't give Ukraine what it needs because Russia will nuke us. But I think what people forget is that, in fact, this kind of restraint is itself escalatory. If you tell your opponent you will not suffer consequences for aggressive behavior, they will engage in more aggressive behavior. It's that simple. So I really worry that in its effort to prevent escalation, the Biden administration has actually escalated the conflict much more than it would have been if they had allowed Ukraine to respond right away.
Timothy.
I mean, I think what Lucan just said should be published as an op-ed like around the world. That's a very important and profound point. Looking back at a war 1,000 days in, I think the strangest thing about this war, the thing that historians will notice, is that the aggressor has been allowed to set the rules of engagement. That is historically unprecedented. One country invades another country, and then the country that invades gets to make up new rules about what the invaded country is allowed to do. That has never happened before. And the oddest thing about this conversation is the way that we have all internalized this, the way we all think, okay, we have to wait and see what the Russians think. That's not how you fight a war. You fight a war by making sure that the aggressor country is no longer able to continue it. It's not a therapeutic session for Mr. Putin. It's a normal hot war in which things have to be arranged such that they can't fight any longer.
Having said that, Michael, how seriously do you think the majority of Ukrainians take the threat from the Kremlin to use nuclear weapons if this thing persists?
Well, first of all, if I can, on a word on the deterrent factor, even the way the news of these attack comes, and Timothy is right, they are pretty much short range, but it does put into their sights the southern military district of Russia. Even the way the news leaked out was projecting weakness. Mr. Biden did not give a formal announcement. Calls from the media to confirm this were not answered. And I'm not calling for Mr. Biden to imitate Ronald Reagan in 1987 as he did to Gorbachev and said, tear down this wall. But I think he should have said at least, we will stare you down. We will meet your missiles with our missiles, and you're not going to be able to pound or pummel Ukraine into darkness and deteriorate its sovereignty. In terms of the Ukrainians, I think this has been quite the morale boost, but it's what one of our panelists said as well, is that it's a little bit too little, too late. And whether you go to military cemeteries in Odessa, in Lviv, in Kiev, they are now overflowing, a lot of them. The Ukrainians have spilt a lot of blood, as our other panelists have said, on behalf of the world, because indeed this is a globalized war, and it's becoming more so. I think the Ukrainians finally will also tell you that, the Russians can set any red lines they like, but look at the red line the Ukrainians crossed when they invaded Kursk during the summertime. Look at the lack of robust response from the Russian side. I think it points to how hollowed out the Russian Defense Ministry has been over the years because of corruption. It could point also to disagreement within the Putin circle and to disorganization among the various agencies that were tasked to push the Ukrainians back. So I think it's a big illusion as well how much strength the Russians actually have to meet any of this type of response from Ukraine and the West.
Lucan.
Yeah, so I mean, Russia already assumes that the West is going to attack it. So sort of the idea that somehow by, short, long range, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers, that's going to make any difference at all, I think is completely wrong. What Russia is held in by is its own capacity. So we have to reduce its capacity to strike. That will limit the escalation on the Russian side.
Maria, I wonder, though, the recent American election, the majority of Americans voted for a presidential candidate who was very clearly on the record.
Not majority.
It was not a majority.
49.9%.
It was not a majority.
Okay.
Close.
49.9. Is that where it's at right now?
That's where we are now.
Okay. Appreciate the correction. 49.9, with still some votes to count, but okay, let's say 49.9. Let's say the largest plurality of Americans clearly voted for a candidate who wants this war over and does not certainly show any signs of going to bat for Ukraine in the way that his predecessor did. If the larger chunk of the American public is not behind this war, does that hamstring what America will do going forward?
Polls actually show that a big majority of Americans support Ukraine and want Ukraine to win. A bipartisan majority of Americans, almost over 2/3. I think the reason this doesn't seem to show up or to be reflected in the presidential election is Americans don't really vote on foreign policy. This was a domestically driven outcome. So I think actually President Trump will end up realizing that his fantasy about negotiating a solution in a couple of days is not going to work, and then he will have to react in some way to the fact that he will not have a deal, and Americans will be watching, and they will not want Ukraine to be betrayed.
Timothy, is there any possibility that Donald Trump could be on the level when he says, I can solve this in a day? Is that imaginable to solve this in a day?
Well, we already know that didn't happen because his promise was actually that he would solve it within a day after the election, not a day after his inauguration. Wow. So he's already failed, and he has to fail. And Maria's entirely right. What has happened thus far has been Russia ritually humiliating Trump by showing his wife naked on television, by escalating when he says he told them to de-escalate, by denying a phone call took place when Trump says a phone call took place. That's what we're going to see. I mean, in my view, and others can disagree, but in my view, the Russians perceive Trump as so weak that any offer he puts on the table can be made better by bullying him more. The optimistic scenario, which I will just give voice to, the optimistic scenario is that Trump at some point recognizes that he's being bullied and humiliated and feels like he has to respond. That's as good as it could possibly get. Personally, I'm quite skeptical of that. I think Mr. Trump's ability to be subservient to Putin probably doesn't have a floor, and he's surrounded himself by people, including Elon Musk, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who are quite clearly pro-Putin type folks.
Michael, can I get you to weigh in on that?
Sure. I think that one of the problems we're faced with, not only during the election period, but then in the weeks leading up, is the Americans have done a very poor job, the Democrats especially, in terms of enunciating what could be the knock-on effects of this war escalating, especially when it has the potential to hit Americans' pocketbooks, as I referred to earlier, blocking off the Black Sea to wheat and sunflower exports, that type of thing. So I think if especially European leaders take it upon themselves to start screaming louder that perhaps we're not going to see Mr. Putin strike really hard on Ukraine, but I think they're going to turn to more nefarious ways, cutting submarine cables that are, described as accidents, or poisoning opponents on foreign soil, blocking GPS signals, trying to put explosives on commercial aircraft, meddling in elections. The list goes on and on and on. And this will eventually make life a lot more dangerous in a lot of democracies around the world. That's the message that really needs to get home to voters. And don't forget, we have a lot more elections happening later, in the next few months in various democracies around the world. So really important to get that out.
I want to, let's just do a little shift in course here. And Luke, and I'll start with you. I want to get to, in particular, the two Canadian-based academics here to weigh in on this. How effective an ally for Ukraine has Canada been?
Well, I think it's certainly in some ways on its best, although it's on a per capita level, Canadian aid, of course, in absolute terms, Canadian aid is much lower than the United States, but it's a much smaller country. But even on a per capita level, aid to Ukraine has been lower than the United States. And I think, there's certain limitations in Canada's military capacity that sort of limit the extent to which it can aid Ukraine in the war.
Maria, can I get your view, and as I add to the record here, the fact that the Deputy Prime Minister of the country has a Ukrainian background and has obviously been extremely seized of this file. How strong an ally have we been?
We have been a strong ally rhetorically, but not so much in terms of delivering what Ukraine needs. As Lucan mentioned, part of this is because we're not really spending a lot on our defense anyway, so we don't have a lot to give. But we are bottom of the pack, let's face it, in terms of actual contribution. So I think in order to make a bigger difference, knowing that our capacity is limited, we should either have started investing more in defense, or we should really have put more effort into pushing through our diplomatic, ability as a mid-power to really push some for some things that are not related to defense spending. Push more to confiscate Russia's frozen assets, for example. Become a leader on this file and really get the allies around the idea that this needs to be done. This, for example, would have been something that might have compensated for the fact that we cannot allocate much military aid.
Okay, a little over 5 minutes to go here, and I want to get all of you to weigh in on whether you agree or disagree with the statement I'm about to make. The Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, will have to compromise with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, because neither country has yet to demonstrate that it can militarily defeat the other on the battlefield. We agree or disagree, Timothy, on that?
I just want to make sure that somebody says North Korea before this show is over. There are 10,000 North Korean troops fighting now in Europe. There could be 100,000 in the next few weeks. If Canada and other Western democracies are going to think about the situation, the fact that East Asian troops are now essentially invading Europe is something that ought to be kept in mind. I disagree with that formulation because I think wars are won and lost. I think no one ever has to negotiate because of some abstract reason. You win a war or you lose a war. Those of us who want Ukraine to win have to do what we can to make that possible. And those who want Russia to negotiate have to do exactly the same thing.
Michael, your view on whether it is incumbent upon Zelensky to compromise harder given the state of play?
Well, I think it would be very difficult for any Ukrainian president to give up anything that the Russians are demanding or that the vice president-elect has parroted on behalf of the Kremlin and said basically freeze the lines where they are, demilitarize zone, and freeze Ukraine's NATO bid. So I don't know how we could get around that, but perhaps it will take more massive intervention from Turkey, from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, who have been quite effective on and off during the conflict in terms of POW exchanges and that sort of thing. And I should also add that perhaps Mr. Trump won't be able to solve this in a day. He's shown he hasn't been able to. But I think the one person who could pick up the phone, because he has him on speed dial, to call Mr. Putin and demand that he stop the war is Xi Jinping of China because of their relationship and because China is the bigger guy in the room. And quickly, as the Ukrainian Canadian on the panel, I have to say that I'm very disappointed that not only on the Ukraine file, but others as well, Canada is no longer punching above its weight. Our stature on the international stage has been very, very weakened in the past while. And we see that, for example, by Mr. Trudeau seemingly wanting to be not only prime minister, but foreign minister as well, appointing a weaker deputy on the foreign affairs file. And finally, it saddens me too that so much time was lost at the start of the war when Mr. Trudeau, I think mistakenly, put so much stock in sanctions against Russia where other means could have been provided, for example, weaponry and training from the get-go.
Understood. Okay, Lucan, come on in on this issue of whether Zelensky needs to compromise harder to get a solution done.
So a few things. First, I think the frame, there has been this sort of framing that somehow Zelensky has it in his capacity to end the war. That is simply not. One person has it in their capacity. That's Putin. And Zelensky cannot by himself end the war. I think sure. I think it's actually conceivable. I mean, given the sort of shifts in Ukrainian public opinion, that sort of the Ukrainian public would sort of accommodate itself to reduction in territory, but only and this is where the West is central, come in, if there is a plausible, viable security guarantee. And that is the most important thing going on right now. The minute you can only really begin to talk about negotiation when the West comes up with a mechanism. NATO is the most obvious one, but NATO doesn't work. Call it something else. Call it, whatever. As long as, Russia is effectively deterred from invading, because until then, negotiations are pointless because you can negotiate endlessly. Russia's just going to endlessly invade and the like.
Maria, there's a G20 summit taking place in Rio right now. Should we have any expectation that something useful will come out of that as it relates to this?
No, not really. There seems to be a proposal by Erdogan that's being discussed, but the Russians immediately shut it down, as even though it was quite useful for them, proposing to freeze Ukraine's NATO accession for 10 years, freezing the territorial realities, but the Russians showed very clearly, yet again, that they're not willing to compromise right now. So I think that's the reason why the formulation about can Zelensky, will he need to compromise, is really a moot point, because there's no compromise being offered. There's no compromise on the table right now. And Ukraine needs to somehow be in a position to even begin to compromise, because what the Russian side is offering right now is negotiations on the term of surrender. That's all.
Timothy, it's often been said when two countries are at war that we know what the final outcome is going to look like. We just can't get there from here. Do you agree with that? Do we know what the final outcome is going to look like when it's all said and done? We just got to figure out how to get there?
Wars are any historian will say, wars are very unpredictable. And a competent historian of the world since 1945 will point out that in general, the smaller country beats the bigger country, and the anti-colonial country beats the colonial country. Who wins this war is going to depend largely on how we think about it. That is, those of us who are in a position to help. If we think that Ukraine is doomed, then that's bad. But if we think that Ukraine can win, as of course they can, then we're in a position to make sure that they get to a military situation where Russia has things to think about. And then, as Lucan and others have said, there has to be political support so that Ukrainians can see their way into a future in the European Union, in NATO, a world where they can feel like, okay, we can move forward. Because for them, that's what this has always been about. It's two countries, yes, but it's also two visions of the way the world works. A Russian vision in which anything which is democratic, future-oriented has to be stopped for in the name of one oligarch, and a Ukrainian vision which is more like people should live the way they want to live. The future should be open. That's what's at stake.
I want to thank all four of you for coming on to TVO tonight, particularly Michael Borsecue, who did so under considerable difficult circumstances in Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us. Michael from the Atlantic Council, Maria Popova, Associate Professor, Political Science, McGill University, Timothy Snyder, Yale University, and please check out his newest book, On Freedom, which is an excellent read. Lucan Ahmed Way, University of Toronto, Distinguished Professor there for the study of Ukraine. Thanks so much to the four of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Disruptive behavior in school is not a new phenomenon, but researchers at Brock University have found an increase in incivility since students returned to in-person learning following the pandemic. Joining us now to discuss why the kids aren't all right, we welcome Natalie Spadafora, postdoctoral fellow and adjunct professor in the Department of Child and Youth Studies at Brock University, and Lynn Frank, who's an educator and certified life coach. And just before we get started here, in the interest of full disclosure, we always like to say TVO is an agency of the Ontario Ministry of Education. We've been part of the province's delivery of distance learning since it was created back in 1970. Today, TVO offers online secondary school courses through the Independent Learning Centre and has been asked by the province to develop online courses for use by secondary schools across the province, and we always put that out there in the interest of full disclosure before we start discussions like these. Welcome. Good to have you two here.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Let's share some of the numbers. Natalie, this is your study, you and your team at Brock, comparing survey results from the year 2019 and 2022 to examine whether disruptive behaviors have increased ever since students aged 9 to 14 returned to in-person learning post-pandemic. And here's what they have discovered. Let's go back to 2019 here. 6% of teachers reported daily incidents of incivility. 6%, not a big number. 32% of teachers rated incivility as moderately or very serious. 62% of teachers, quite a good number, rated incivility as slightly or not at all serious. But now let's go to the middle of the pandemic. Now, 2022, 42% of teachers reported daily incidents of incivility. That's 7 times higher than the first number. 68% of teachers rated incivility as moderately or very serious. That's twice as high as pre-pandemic. And only 17% of teachers rated incivility as slightly or not at all serious. In other words, 2/3 lower. The numbers that should be going up are going down. The numbers that should be going down are going up. Natalie, what's going on here?
Good question. So the nice thing about the teacher study piece of the two-study paper that we put out was that we asked the teachers open-ended questions as well, where they got to kind of explain some of these numbers to us. And they overwhelmingly talked about themes of lower self-regulation, higher individualism, and just really like not knowing how to be in school. So those years of online learning, they got to do a lot of things at home that you don't do in a regular classroom. They can get up and leave whenever they want. Nobody cared. They can talk out loud. They're on mute on Zoom. It doesn't matter the same way that it does when they went back to the classroom in the 2021-2022 school year. So that's what we heard from the teachers.
Did you expect these findings?
A little bit, yes. We were kind of, so coming back from the pandemic, the school shutdown piece of it anyways, we were interested. All this stuff is coming out on, academics and social skills, and we've been studying classroom incivility at the Volk Lab at Brock University for a really long time. So we were like, what about incivility specifically? So we kind of thought, with a lack of practice, maybe it would be higher. In the one study with the adolescents, we got to look at the quantitative, that it was significantly higher statistically, boring for everybody else. But the teachers, we got that nice qualitative piece being like, can you tell us why? And so they really supplemented each other. And we think we got a nice little story there.
A nice little story. It's not so nice, this little story.
Well, it makes sense.
Does this jibe with your experiences in the classroom?
It really does. I'd like to say it is in the research that it has gone up since the pandemic. But I want to just say we were leaning into that incivility piece pre-COVID. I've been an educator now for 23 years, and in the last 18 months have traveled across Ontario and worked with hundreds of educators specifically around wellness. And incivility in the classroom comes into that, as I'm sure the research shows. It's important to know that if we're not getting, there's a parenting gap. Well, there's 3 pieces, and a parenting gap I just want to put out there because they really do lay the foundation for what a student is coming into the classroom with, the expectations. I mean, we all want a civil community. And so when students are not showing up with those fundamentals, like wait your turn, look at someone in the eye, raise your hand, just this kindness.
The basics.
The basics. And if that's not coming into the classroom, then the teachers are starting from scratch. And that just delays everything. So
Incivility is actually such a civil sounding word, but this is really not incivility we're talking in some cases here, right, Lynn? This is acting like a jackass out of control in class. Fair to say?
I love that you use that word. Not me. You know what? Natalie said it when she said lack of self-regulation. They are really, and it is due to not being socialized, I think. Students are having a hard time with emotional regulation. And unfortunately, and I know you're doing a show on this tomorrow with budget cuts, but when educators don't have the supports they need in the classroom to deal with not only the learning gap, but mental and emotional needs of students, there's more room for that incivility. And without the self-regulation, rooms are being trashed. Educators are, and I'm talking about our DCEs, our educational assistants. They are in the...
what does that stand for?
Designated educators, early year educators.
Okay.
And they're with our kindergarten, our junior kindergarten and kindergarten teachers. And those primary grades. I'm glad you're going to look at that later. It really is where a lot of the violence is happening.
This shows up in 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds?
It really does.
Oh boy.
Regularly.
Okay. Natalie, what prompted you to want to study this area in the first place?
So we've been studying classroom incivility for a long time. So back, my former mentor, Zapito Marini, studied it. And so as a master's student, I was introduced to it. My whole doctoral dissertation with Dr. Tony Volk was focused on it. So like you said, it wasn't a pandemic. All of a sudden it came to our attention. We've been studying it for a while. This study came in light of the pandemic, but that's kind of what we've been looking at. And I think what we're really interested in, more broadly than that, is that this really low-level antisocial behavior. So in my lab, Dr. Volk studies bullying, people study mental health, people study these higher level antisocial behaviors, but then, and we talk a lot about those, but what about these low level ones that kind of individually might not be that big a deal? Some of them put together, they often are. So really interested in what makes these low level behaviors different and obviously disrupts the learning environment, but what else is happening? What other behavior can it predict? So that's kind of broadly what we've been looking at.
Lynn, how much of this is pandemic induced? How much of this is people have forgotten how to parent? How much of this is the kid is just a demon seed?
You know what? There are 3 major factors, and I would say the parenting gap is one of them. And I don't want to harp on that. It's a piece of the piece of the puzzle, part of the problem. There's also a breakdown in partnership within the educational ecosystem. So
Partnership between whom and whom?
All right, here we go. There is a breakdown between teacher and administrator, administrator and board, and then the ministry is the one who is delegating. And unfortunately, not communicating, in my opinion, effectively with what's happening in the room. It looks good on paper. It looks good on paper. And so a board's hands are almost tied. That's where their funding is coming from. And so the mandates and the initiatives from the ministry are given to the board. And the board has to accept those. They often have a board will have a multi-year plan, and they will intertwine the ministry expectations with the board goals. That gets put down to the administrator, and then the administrator pushes that to the teacher. And it's just, the expectations are high and the support is low. And so, unfortunately, everyone is feeling exhausted and depleted and unable to help and work collectively.
Natalie, can I get you to weigh in on that? How much is board-induced? How much is pandemic-induced? Bad parenting? Bad kids? What do you think?
I think it's a few things. I think first, exactly what Lynn was saying, we hear from teachers all the time, like in previous studies when we've surveyed teachers, they say things like we understand it's easy to say we should reduce incivility as an academic, but there's practical limitations to this, right? Any teacher will say, well, if I stopped the class every time there was an incident or somebody talked while I was talking, I would never get through a lesson. We have quotes from teachers telling us that, right? Yeah. But then left unchecked, all this low-level behavior, they say it escalates, and we know it's predictive of bullying behavior. We know it can be associated with having fewer friends. We know that from the adolescent literature. So it's how do we intervene without, focusing on, we need to focus on academics. There's a lot on teachers to do as well. So we do acknowledge that. Yeah,
it would be nice if teachers and administrators and boards could come together as a collective and in unison share with the ministry what's really needed.
What's preventing that from happening?
I think people are, so a teacher hesitates with the administrator hesitates with the board, and everyone is a little bit worried about the parents, except you know who, Steve?
Who?
The kids. The kids are worried about nobody. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
So there's that parenting gap, there is the breakdown in partnership, and the third piece is budgeting. And those 3 combined have led us to where we are today.
Well, here's a statement from Jill Dunlop, who you may know is the Minister of Education. And we asked the ministry for a statement on what they think of all this, and here is what the minister had to say. The pandemic had a significant impact on students across Ontario and around the world. That is why we invested in historic funding year over year to get students back to basics on reading, writing, and math while removing distractions in school. Since 2018, our government increased student mental health supports by over 595% and invested $47.5 million in support of school safety to fight the negative impacts of mobile devices, social media, and vaping. I'm happy to say, the minister says, that we've heard a tremendous amount of positive feedback from teachers, students, and parents on how they are seeing a return to uninterrupted learning ever since these tools and measures were put in place. And here's where we need a reality check now. Okay, this is the minister's view. You two are on the front lines. Okay, Lynn, start us off here. Have you seen a return to uninterrupted learning since these new tools were put in place?
I have recently worked actually with high school teachers, and the cell phone ban has made a difference.
Positively.
Positively.
Okay.
Okay, so I give kudos to that effort. Having said that, even parents have communicated with the school administrator, can you keep the phone? And it goes back to that parenting gap. They're asking the school to hold on to the phone because they're unable to hold that expectation at home. And so it becomes blurry on who is to maintain this initiative or not, because schools are not going to hoard student cell phones. But more importantly, what I want to say, and is what I encourage all your viewers to go to, is buildbetterschools.ca. And on that site, there is a tool where you could put in your child's school with a postal code. And it will tell you how much funding this school year, 2024 to 2025, has been cut. So every child is...
Can I just understand this?
Yes.
Cut or rate of increase declining? Because there's a difference.
Yes. Okay. So the students this year on an individual basis are not receiving $1,561.91 compared to previous years in funding. That's per student. And at first you're like, well, $1,500, okay, it's not great, but it's not bad. But if you multiply that by the number of students, so the school I taught at last year, 400 students, that's over $600,000 less in that school budget. Those are our educational assistants. Those are textbooks, which a decade ago wasn't a problem, but teachers are actually lacking physical resources, not only support from others. And I encourage your viewers to go do that. And it doesn't matter if you have a child in the system or not. These are our future leaders.
Say the website again?
It is buildingbetterschools.ca.
Okay. Yeah. Natalie, any question in your mind that cell phones in the classroom, vaping in schools contribute to incivility?
I mean, cell phones for sure. That's the example we use over and over again. We all do that. Outside the classroom right now, if I pulled up my cell phone and started looking at it, you'd probably, what would you think, right? Like that's common, and I think that's in our broader society. The one thing when it comes to a lot of these uncivil behaviors, and especially in adolescence, is we always try to think about with antisocial behavior is like, why are they doing it? Like what, and we've kind of tried to get at that with the incivility, is so when we look at incivility specifically, what differentiates it is that there's this ambiguous intent to cause harm often. That's what differentiates from like other behaviors, bigger, higher level behaviors in the classroom. So if I pack up my books early and rush to the door, am I doing it because I want to hurt my teacher's feelings? Probably not. Probably the adolescent's doing it because they want to get the good soccer ball and meet their friend and whatever. So it's just this me. They kind of forget what it might be doing to the group. Same thing with the phone example. So going back to the phone, if I pulled up my phone right now, you'd be like, what is she doing? But if I said, oh, there's a family emergency, something suddenly, this intent is different to you. So that's all. It's really, it makes it more difficult. But I think that is what implicates our broader society, because we do it all the time.
Let me circle back to something you were saying about violence earlier. And that is, at some level, we all think we're experts in education because we all went to school at some point.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, when we all went to school, well, I'm a little older than you two, but when I went to school, there was plenty of violence in the schools. We had fights at recess, and frankly, back then, teachers were allowed to whip students, right? There was corporal punishment in school. So when you tell me today there is violence in schools, I say, no kidding, there has been forever. Is it different today?
It's different today.
How so?
It's different today in that even though conflict amongst peers is normal, right? They are figuring out their own relationships. And so conflict is a part of that. Because students are lacking the ability to communicate and to self-regulate, especially in the primary grades, they get physical. And it is out of aggression, not being able to communicate or to share.
Well, what are we talking? Throwing punches?
Kicking, biting, punching, throwing chairs, tossing tables, desks. And you know what, Steve? These are not isolated incidences. This is happening in classrooms daily.
Weapons?
I am an elementary school teacher, so I haven't come across that. However, in working with high school students, a knife, that has come up a couple times in some schools across the province. But other than that, we're not there yet. But Steve, if what happens in the States is a precursor, and I tend to believe sometimes, unfortunately, our education system is moving that way. Let us look at the warning signs so that we can be proactive, so that we could come together as a collective. You know, someone says to me, well, I don't have a kid in the system anymore. I went there and it was fine. And I say to them, we need education to have a growing economy. We need an education because it grants us opportunity for innovation, and that makes us competitors in the global market. So if you like money, if you like your health care system, if you really want to support public education for the better of us all, please get involved. It's really, we need to come together as a collective.
You're sitting in a studio named after former education minister and Premier Bill Davis, and he used to say, you get education right, everything else falls into place.
I love that.
You get a healthier society, you get a better
Yes.
employed society, you get a more just society, you get better, anyway, you get all of that. Talk to me about this. Have we given students, in your view, too many rights?
It's a tough question. I mean, I feel like sometimes, like you were talking about when you were a kid, the pendulum was way over there, and now we've swung it way over there, and it wasn't okay back then, and now, you know, I think everyone's trying for the most part. I would hope, like, you know, we talk about these teachers. Teachers are trying really hard. I've been very careful. I was saying to you, I've done a lot of, this caught a lot of media traction, I've done a lot of interviews. I don't think it's necessarily any one person's fault. I think, you know, there's the gaps you speak of. I think the teachers are trying. There's a lot on them. I think there's a lot of things at play here. The school shutdowns did not help, you know. Anecdotally, people will say, well, it was increasing already, kind of what you were saying.
Well, apropos of that, anecdotally, I mean, I must say I hear a lot of anecdotal evidence where young students know that there's a lot that schools can't do to them nowadays, right? And therefore, they think they can get away with a lot more than we ever could back in the day. Now, that's anecdotal.
Right.
You got longitudinal evidence that proves that that's the case?
We haven't asked questions like that, but we do know from talking to the adolescents that they're very aware, right? So, and again, we look at this low-level antisocial behavior, so not some of the higher-level stuff that we know happens. That's not what we've looked at. But we've asked them. They'll answer questions and say, like, oh, yeah, I talk when the teacher's talking, and I know I shouldn't. And when other students do it, it disrupts me. Like, they're very aware, like the adolescents especially. It's not like they do it and they don't know it's disrupting the class. They say it disrupts them. They say it harms their learning. They know that. But then they'll say, oh, yeah, I text during class. I talk when the teacher's talking. So it's just this interesting kind of thing. But we know adolescence especially is different, that there are some benefits. You know, we've done studies where the people who engage in some levels of classroom incivility actually have the most number of friends. The people who engage in the most levels of classroom incivility have the least. But there is something like a sweet spot of like moderate levels, because maybe, you know, you're texting, you have friends to text, you're the popular kid, right? Kind of mirroring that adolescent bullying literature that says, like, you know, popular kids bully to get status. So lots of interesting things at play.
In which case, Lynn, how do you want to empower either teachers or parents or administrators or whoever's got a piece of the action here to be able to make some headway against this?
First, we have to start talking. We have to be open about it. Teachers are very comfortable answering an anonymous survey.
They sure are.
We're okay. We're okay in the staff room. But 77% of teachers are women. And women have been conditioned, socialized, to not cause trouble, to avoid conflict. And so part of that keeps us very quiet. And when you're looking at 77% of the workforce being women, we huddle and keep it to ourselves. And so really the number one, the step is thank you, creating the opportunity to talk about it openly. I said some things that I know for a fact my colleagues would be like, can't believe she said that. It's okay. It's okay, because if we don't stretch that boundary, then change is not going to happen, and change is uncomfortable. So knowing that other people, academics, are looking into it, supporting what we're seeing in the class, that's another step forward. And to know that we are supported will encourage us to speak more. I know the unions are doing what they can to try and get the message out to the public. I need the public. We need the public to get involved. And so empowering teachers, administrators, members of the school board is first to allow them space to speak, to let them know that what is going on is not their fault. It's systemic. And hopefully that'll create room for conversation.
Natalie, down to my last minute here. Is this a problem we actually can solve?
I don't know if we're going to solve anything, but we're going to make better steps forward, right? And it's exactly what we said at the beginning, that teaching civility. So very basic, back to basics, fostering civility, because civil kids mean civil youth, and then hopefully means civil adults that we're interacting with every day. So really going back to basics.
Parents, do your jobs.
They got to help.
Parents got to help, right? They got to parent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it takes effort, right? We know that. Anyone says, somebody said to me the other day, my supervisor actually, that, I got complimented on my kids' manners at the restaurant the other day. And I thought to myself, yeah, that took a lot of work. Like, it's not, we acknowledge that. We're not, it's really easy to do. It takes time. It's harder to say please. It's harder to do all those things. But I think we'd all agree it's worth it.
And once we have, if in the home, school is important, value your education, then kids are walking in with respect, because what's happening now is they don't really care. And in high schools, if they hand things in late, you know what? They have an opportunity to resubmit. If they fail, they have an opportunity to resubmit. If they're fighting, there's very little accountability. And so I like when you use the pendulum. We don't want to go to corporal punishment, but the pendulum has swung too far.
Let's get it back to the
middle. Kids are not being held accountable for their lack of effort in the classroom, both academic and behavioral.
Mr. Director, can I get a two-shot? Well, okay, you want to do a three-shot or a two-shot? I'm easy, either way. There's a two-shot. That's Lynn Frank, certified life coach, and Natalie Spadafora from the Department of Child and Youth Studies at Brock University, and we're grateful to both of you for your contributions here on TVO tonight.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, November 19th, 2024. Why are so many school boards in Ontario in the red? Join us for that discussion tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.